Well, my name's Jonathan Foyle, and I teach conservation of historic buildings at the University of Bath, and or Bath, if you want. Depends how close you are, I suppose.
Yeah. So, to begin with, if you want to just give a brief overview of the programme itself.
The MSc, Masters in Historic Conservation at Bath, it takes place in the Department of Architecture, Civil Engineering, and each of the MSCs that's offered around Britain has a unique situation. Some might be archaeology, others media, but Bath tries to be a very broad course. So its position in architecture, civil engineering draws in the skill sets from those teaching staff. And so you learn about project management, you learn about structures, and but also, and what I specialize in is the humanities side of things. So where does conservation come from? What does significance mean? What about the history of the built environment? How do we know what we're looking at? And all of those questions I've always found fascinating. So my background was studying architecture, but then I did a master's degree in art history and PhD in archaeology, because it's like a never-ending quest, really. You know, you can understand buildings, but then you realize that only a certain number of buildings are left, and some of them partially survive, and each one of those has information. So we begin the course by teaching you how to look and how to think about conservation, and then you build the skills as you go through the year.
Cool. So when we say conservation, we're talking about keeping things as they are. Would you say that that's fair?
It's a frequent assumption about conservation is that we're trying to make time stand still, you know, or pretend that nothing's ever happened, or return a building to its original state. Names like renovation and conservation are often interchangeable, but they're dramatically different, actually, when you think about them. Renovation is to make something new again. Conservation isn't about that. It's not about pretending time stands still. If you're to crystallize it, you're to say it's to make smart decisions about managing change. Change is inevitable, but there's good change and there's bad change. You know, amongst the most drastic things that can happen to a building is collapse or neglect. And suddenly you see how, if maintenance doesn't happen, buildings can really accelerate in their decay. But you find a really good user of a building, which might otherwise be neglected. It might have fallen out of use. It might be surplus to requirements, but you get a good user who's got imagination, and the building can enter a really interesting new phase in its life. I mean, like us all, you know, we all evolve, we all change, and buildings do the same thing. They just need care and planning. So what we teach are how to make good decisions. What are the components of really good conservation? How do you combine things like a business plan and something called a CMP, a conservation management plan, to enable you to think for the future and to plan strategically and cost effectively, and make the best of historic buildings, because once they're gone, and you can't get them back. But often a really smart set of decisions can completely transform them.
Mm-hmm. So in a way, conservation is like every theatre space that's turned into a Wetherspoons?
Well, Wetherspoons, I suppose, is one form of conservation, yeah. If you think about King's Cross Station, it was authentic in its way. There were lots of gas cylinders there and in post-industrial landscape, but it wasn't open to anybody. You know, it was fenced off, and weeds and trees were growing in there, and it was just sad and forlorn and derelict. And, you know, there can be a certain magic in those post-industrial sites, I suppose. But in the middle of a city, you want places to be useful. There are millions of people who live in this place and pass through this station every year. So the way that the King's Cross was transformed wasn't simply by putting a pub in it. It was by building new infrastructure, creating new routes through this site, using the canal that was always there, and having books sold on barges, for example, and seats down to that canal, and new shops and new businesses. So there are jobs for people. All that's part of the conservation landscape. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, clearly you need a pint somewhere, but we need more than that as a culture.
So the type of student that's going to take this course, what's their background going to look like?
We have students from all kinds of backgrounds. You might be an architect, you could be a historian, you might be a humanities student, maybe you do geography and just want to change or something. I mean, I know so many art historians came out of law because the prospect of just trying to take advantage of people was too much for them and they wanted beautiful things instead. So look, the MSc Conservation, you can have lots of different backgrounds because in fact, it is a very broad course. If you like legislation, then if you come from a law background, fantastic. Or if you're organized, or maybe you like the humanities part. And if you're a historian, you'd enjoy that. If you're a scientist, let's say you did biology or chemistry, and you're interested in things like lime on buildings or pigments, or the analysis and treatment of wall paintings, that kind of stuff, you can use those skills and build them in. So the way that the course is structured is to allow you to bring your background, to find a specialism in a certain area, and then we'll help you to look for those vocational outcomes that make the best of where you've come from. Mm-hmm. It is a really broad church, and that's what makes it fascinating because you're constantly learning from people with different kinds of skills than yourself.
So what kind of careers would people that take this program go on to do?
So conservation is, it happens around the world, but in different cultures. And those cultures have different kinds of government bodies, different sorts of trusts, for example, and charities and public engagement with conservation. So we have students that work, for example, with the Indian National Trust for Art and Archaeology. And that's very different to our National Trust. It's more of a government, a body that oversees sites. We have someone who runs the conservation body in Canada, someone who works in the Saudi government oversight. And each of those will have a different kind of culture because their legal frameworks will be different. The kinds of buildings you're talking about between, let's say, Saudi Arabia and Canada are obviously going to be totally different. And so those skills are often quite localized. But when you break it down, in England, it's particularly rich. I mean, one of the countries, along with the United States, there are many others, but we are one of the founding countries of the conservation movement. So we have a very well-developed national trust. 5 million members is something quite extraordinary in comparison with our population size, right? So there are lots of jobs in the National Trust. English Heritage and Historic England are two sides of the same coin that run sites, but also provide oversight, things like listing, conservation officers, supervisors of design in urban areas and countryside as well. But then there are lots of charities who are set up because of things like the lottery funding that the UK has. So our special conditions have this very big, broad rainbow of work with conservation. And each of the projects that might be commissioned by those bodies could have someone like a paint analyst who tells you what layers of paint your building had over time, on a forensic level. That kind of work is fascinating. You might actually come from a building background and do this. I mean, I'd really love for building companies to have some of their staff, whether it's project management staff or some of their skilled builders, to join us for a year and really build up that sensibility on what conservation is. And you could do it from any part of the world because you take the framework that we give you and then apply it to your local needs through your innate interests. So last year, one of my students was a Saudi student, and he loved mud architecture in Saudi. Most of it's gone now, but the Saudi ministry has recognized that it's precious and needs to be looked after. And he took a lead on it. So he chose for his dissertation an analysis of Saudi mud brick building. And it was really insightful. It's a very thorough job, and he made his contacts and he demonstrated his work and he went back to Saudi and immediately employable. So it's a really rewarding thing. And at my stage of career, I've had lots of different kind of jobs over the ages. I say, it tells you something. I've had lots of jobs over the years, I'll say. In things like media and as a curator at Hampton Court, working on Canterbury Cathedral, as a consultant. I still do consultancy. So I really want to help train a new generation to think smart and get gainful employment in the conservation sector. So that's the reward for me, is to see students filling these places. And they surprise me because, around the world, they teach back.
Mm-hmm.
So I get a lot out of it.
Yeah, I imagine the skills are quite transferable as well. And you talked about consultancy work. I imagine you're useful if a film needs to check in on a building that they're making it look right and things like that.
Well, I'm lucky I know people who work for film companies in finding good sites for film locations.
Mm-hmm.
Those places that are well conserved, and they know them, and they know that things like the windows are correct.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many films that get made in Bath.
Yeah.
And the windows are all bright white. And if you're a nerd like me and you say, well, titanium white only happened from the 1920s. So what do you mean, Mr. Darcy? It doesn't really work. But so there'll be people who are expert in understanding the built environment and what it should look like in, let's say, Turner's England for a film to be made. So, yeah, you can have lots of different places within conservation. You can use, for example, historical skills and analysis if you want to be a consultant for people who own listed buildings. And you may like the charm of an old building, but you might be petrified by the idea of needing permission to make changes. But if you've got a good consultant on your side, they will understand the building for you, and they'll arm you with reports that show to any conservation officer that you understand what it is and are sympathetic to it. And that understanding has informed your proposed changes.
Mm-hmm.
How can people argue against that? And why would they? I mean, they're just pleased to see that level of understanding. So that kind of work can be diverse. It can keep you in business, for many decades, because, as we say, change will happen, and it's about enabling it. So, there's so many good jobs to be had, and some of them you write for yourself.
Yeah. And touching on that and touching on the idea of the future, is sustainability something that you focus on a lot as well? Conservation
is at the forefront of sustainability, and the University of Bath's architecture department prides itself on sustainability in architectural design. But clearly, one of the most sustainable things is not to wreck what you've already got. It's an act of humility as well. It makes us appreciate what we've got, and we live in such a throwaway culture. That if we can retain even something like let's say a small terraced house, has as much energy in it as would take you to drive around the world in a small car. And the firing of bricks, the transportation of timber, all of that embedded energy shouldn't be wasted in a hole in the ground, just requiring more carbon to be burnt. So just keeping things is a major act of conservation. We're also looking at very low impact maintenance, doing the least necessary to keep the place the way that it is, and using materials as well of natural origin that can be replaced and can be repaired rather than demolished. I mean, one of the obvious differences is the swathe of UPVC windows that are in houses up and down the country, and it's poisonous to manufacture. And you can't repair it. So what happens? They ends up with skips. You're supposed to be maintenance free. And the catcher there is that it means you can't repair it. So it starts to weather. Bare aluminium turns back into bauxite, the powder that aluminium, is made from. And things will decay, things will change. And if you can't repair them, it means they're skipped, they're junked after 20 years. But if you've got natural materials, you can piece in small parts, like a timber post. If it rots a bit at the bottom, we'll then splice a piece in, and that gentle care, looking after what we've got, that's really important. But another aspect about historic buildings is that, again, they're at the forefront of energy thinking because they're difficult. Let's think about a church where you've got a big volume, and if you put the heating on, all the heat goes straight up to the roof, and the roof can't be insulated because it's 15th century timber, big windows. What happens then? You get this great cycle of hot air going up, cold air coming down from the windows, and that you can't feel the place heated up, and you spend hundreds of pounds on heating. Well, in the last few years, infrared has done a big job in rethinking how we heat people. And infrared heaters are radiant. And so if you direct rays at where people are, it's like feeling something like a warm spring day. It's like sunshine. Infrared is essentially the wavelength of sunshine. And it's extremely comfortable. And it costs something like maybe 2/7 or maybe a third of the amount that your regular heating will. It's not burning oil. You can put it on a renewables tariff. And so suddenly we've got the technology in place and the renewable energy options to make historic buildings work again. Sure, it needs some capital costs, but it's one of the things that we consider. How much would this cost? What would the effect be? And how can we green buildings so that they are efficient to run? A lot of people see them as money pits, but we've got the technology to change that now. And so if we can produce a generation of people working within renewable energy, fantastically rewarding.
So you mentioned quite a variety of vocations that they could go into. So how do you teach conservation to prepare students towards those outcomes?
It is a challenge to teach conservation on a global scale. I mean, imagine getting in a minibus and saying, right, we're off to India and have a look at Hampi or another great archaeological site. Tell you what, Machu Picchu next week. Get your boots on, kids. That'd
be amazing.
It would be amazing. It would be. But we do have what we tend to do is we bring in specialists in conservation. So it's not just the staff teaching. It's people who are involved in different kinds of projects on the ground. Now, there are many examples of, for example, materials like lime and mud building, which are applicable around the world. Adobe building, for example, in Latin American countries of using dried mud bricks and then plastering over them is very similar to what happens in Mesopotamia, has done for thousands of years, or Egypt, for example, or India. And people are thinking creatively about how to use such things as plastic bottles, which might go in landfill, as the core of walls that are then surrounded by mud, because actually they're really good insulators. There are lots of creative things going on around the world. So materials have this universal quality. Once you know what the chemical makeup is and how they handle, that doesn't change much around the world. You can just think about local applications. Legislation tends to be international, so that the various conservation charters that have emerged over the last 100 years, pretty much, are those which countries are signatories to. So there is a global culture of conservation, and you can apply those to many different countries. So materials, legislation, the thinking as well, the philosophy behind conservation is something which has contributions from many different sorts of culture. And the habits that some people have with historic buildings are things that we bring into the classroom to say, have you thought about doing this or taking that kind of approach? Or what would happen if we turned historic buildings into this model of living, let's say? We are, I think, in an age where people have access to so much information on the internet that and our climate is changing. And we need to learn from other cultures, things like planting with buildings or the behavior of materials within a warmer and a drier world. Are all things that we're trying to feed into this discussion. So the answer is, how do we shape vocations globally, is to teach things which have a universal value to them and encourage students to think on their terms, from the background that they've come from, the buildings they're used to. Think about these ideas and then work that into their coursework. In the spring, we have an interdisciplinary project where you combine your learning on history and how to analyze the built environment, archival research, your structural understanding, and all of that is combined into one major project where you're working in a team. This year it was a site in Bradford-on-Avon, so a beautiful historic town. And we're thinking, how can we make good interventions in Bradford? And so a couple of sites that people had to think about. And one of the issues in that site was that the river is now flooding more than it has before. So how do you make buildings flood-proof? That can require some quite radical rethinking of what we think conservation is. And I'm sure that any student who is involved in that is going to go back to their own country and think, do you know what? The world is changing around us. And we have to figure out how to treat the past to make it fit for the future. So that's how we teach it. We think about universal themes and we train people in issues that are going to have that global relevance. Really.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. What's the most interesting project that you've worked on?
I really like variety. So if I said, what's the most interesting project I've worked on professionally? I spent 8 years at Hampton Court as buildings curator there. And it was a marvelous education. So I did my PhD on working out how much had Cardinal Wolsey built when he was Henry VIII's right-hand man, and building this place in 1515 up to 1528, more or less. And then Henry VIII took it over and remodeled it, took the credit for himself. And Cardinal Wolsey's papers ended up on a bonfire in Norfolk in the 18th century, most of them. So the history suits the winners, but you have to look through that and figure out, without a lot of the evidence there, how do we look at the building and figure that out? And that was a huge privilege to be involved with a building of that size and scale. And something you look back on and, pinch yourself that you had that chance. So that's great. But on the other hand, more recently, I've been asked by people like homeowners, I think my house is older than the listed building statement says it is. Someone has an end of terrace cottage in Hampshire by the coast, for example, and said it's thought of as early 19th century, but I'm pretty sure it's older than that. Can you tell me? So I'll go along with my archaeological hat on and a torch and a camera and notebooks and the rest of it, and peel back the layers. And I really enjoy showing people what it is they live with and why their house has the character it has and when people would have made changes. Because in fact, this end of terrace cottage was just 1/3 of a medieval house. And she lived in the bedroom end of the medieval house. And so someone else lived in the kitchen end at the far end, and then the hall in the middle. And once you're up in the attic and you can see this roof structure going through the whole thing and understand why, because the windows were replaced in the 19th century, someone doing a drive-by said, well, that's late Georgian house. Getting under the skin, even of a small building, can be really richly rewarding, because you know that that's somewhere that they've invested in over the years that they feel is special to them. And suddenly it's much more special. And you think about how much does a house cost these days? I mean, it's a phenomenal amount of money.
Too much, some might say.
Yeah, but the modest investment in Foyle services means that for not much money, you've actually transformed your appreciation for something, which is a major part of your life, and I get a kick out of that.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so many ways in which work can be interesting. What happens, of course, as a student is you start off building the tools. Students who question why they're being told things are always interesting, because the next generation always has slightly different ideas and understanding. And it takes that rebellion to start to question, why do we believe what we believe? And sometimes it might reinforce the reasons for that belief, but the cracks might show. And some of the best students are those that say, look, where are the cracks? And what happens if we just leave them open a bit and look underneath there? That's where research starts to find new solutions. Mm-hmm. And I'm always interested in students who come to me and say, well, I'll challenge that, because I welcome it.
Can you look at a building and tell everyone when it was built?
Pretty much, yeah.
That's pretty cool. Okay. And when you were at Hampton Court Palace, did you come across the ghost of Catherine Howard?
Screaming Catherine Howard, yeah, who by repute thunders down the haunted gallery, mm-hmm. hence its name, outside the chapel. Oh, receiving that bad news. No, I didn't.
Oh.
The best I can do, and I was with the previous archaeologist at the time, is that we went upstairs into the oldest part of the palace, and both of us heard a cockerel crowing. And there are no chickens kept at Hampton Court, but there used to be a scalding house where chickens were put into boiling water to pluck their feathers in the Tudor age.
Ghost chickens.
Both of us like to think that we tuned into a ghost chicken.
Yeah.
Mm.
Amazing. So what we've sort of touched on it, but experiences and rewards that make the conservators stay interested in their work?
Yeah, the experiences and rewards are are something akin to what I've just described as you don't know what your next project's going to be very often. Even if you're working, let's say, for the National Trust or English Heritage, one of the government bodies, or you're a consultant, then what's going to turn up? What's the next project going to be? And let's say you think you know what that project lands on your inbox. You say, oh, for the next 4 years, we're going to be working on completely turning around this great Georgian country house or something into a new chapter. But there's so much to discover. There's opening up, which shows you phases. It may not just be a Georgian house. There may be an older core to it that the Georgian house was built around, let's say. You're going to be learning about the history of the occupants, how much of the building is authentic and how much has been pieced together over the years. You might be looking at things like the decorative history, the color of the paintwork, what's remains and what's lost, and how do you mitigate that? Can things be recovered? All of that research is, that's one big part of it. The project management aspect of what are we going to do and why and in what order, and where do we get the money from, and those kinds of issues. And they can be fascinating if you're project management minded. And then how's the thing going to be run and managed, and how do we market it? How do we get the word out? And I taught the media side of conservation for numerous episodes at Bath. I mean, I did 1 day a year for a decade at Bath, because in a previous job I used to run something called the World Monuments Fund, the British branch. So we raised money for sites. So the way in which you conceive a project and then how you get the word out and explain what you're doing and build support, that's something I've been used to. And it's really fundamental to a successful project is engaging a community, engaging supporters, and making people feel like they can be a part of this positive change. It's such an important part. And there will be people who come from a conservation training background who want to be part of that. Write the text, build the membership, organize the events, that kind of stuff, because it's just another aspect. So even a simple sounding thing is complex, and it keeps you interested because the stages will roll forward and you'll be building on your successes. And then finally, one day, the thing will be finished and the doors will open and you'll say it went from that into this. And I played my part in that. And I got to say, there are few jobs that are as tangibly rewarding as transforming the built environment, honoring what was gifted to us from the past, and then actually looking after generations to come by handing that over in a form that is useful and beautiful. I mean, I don't know what else I'd want out of a career.
Fantastic. If potential students are interested in learning more, can they get in touch with you?
They can, via admissions at the University of Bath. So you'll see an MSc course page with information. Scroll to the bottom to see a film that we've recently put together on site in Bradford-on-Avon and in Bath Abbey and other of the sites around here. I mean, we're so lucky for a glorious built environment near Bath and Bristol and Somerset, not far from London. But you'll get a sense of that in the film. If you like what you see, do write to admissions, and admissions can organise. There's a one-to-one form if you want to talk to a course convener, and we'd be delighted.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thanks.